I'm going to teach you the entire story of Exodus in 15 minutes. Think you can do it? You already know the story of Genesis. Let's tell the story of Genesis again. You ready? There's two parts to Genesis. There are 4 events and 4 people. The 4 events are creation, fall, flood, nations. The 4 people are Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Israel, and Joseph. Abraham was promised, you'll be a great nation, and I will bless you to be a blessing to the nations. Then the impossible happened. Sarai gave birth to Isaac 14 years later. He had Ishmael before that. By the way, Ishmael was born to Abraham's slave Hagar. And Ishmael is the father of what has come to be known as the Arabic people. And the battle between the Islam and Christianity and Judaism today is a sibling rivalry between Ishmael and Isaac. It goes all the way back that far, which is why it's not going to be solved overnight. Okay? So we have Ishmael is born, but he was not the child of promise because Abram was promised that Sarai would give birth to a son. And she became Sarah. She gave birth to Isaac. So we have this miraculous child who is born to a barren older woman. And then God asks Abraham to sacrifice Isaac at the altar. That's what this picture of Isaac, of Abraham holding up this knife over Isaac to test Abraham's faith. But God spares Isaac, and Isaac has a son, and his name is Jacob. But he actually had a twin brother. Jacob's older twin brother was named Esau. So you have Esau and Jacob. And Esau was like a burly man who liked to go out and hunt, and Isaac really loved him best. And then Rebekah was Isaac's wife. She loved Jacob more than Esau. And so you have this sibling rivalry. Jacob was a scoundrel. He was a liar and a thief. And yet God promised to Jacob that Jacob would be the one through which the promise was revealed. How many of you, that makes you feel better about yourself? If God can use Jacob to be the father of his nation, he can use you to do anything. But Jacob's name was changed to Israel because Israel means wrestles with God. The entire story of this promised and blessed nation is one of a child wrestling with her parent, right? And I think that's the story of all of our lives. We have this loving parent who wants the best for us, and yet we push and struggle against God. So Jacob, Israel, is the father of the 12 boys who become the 12 tribes of Israel. And the second to youngest of the 12 boys is named Joseph. And Joseph has some dreams. And Joseph has dreams that he is going to be worshipped and bowed down to by his brothers. And it's the Joseph of the Technicolor Dreamcoat. Jacob favors Joseph and gives him a cloak that makes him special and different than his brothers. And so sibling rivalry and envy rises up, and they sell him as a slave into Egypt. So suddenly we have this promised nation, which is basically just 12 brothers at this point, and the 11th brother is sold into slavery in Egypt. Very good. And Joseph remains faithful. Joseph is one of the only characters in the whole Bible who doesn't mess it up. Isn't that interesting? When everything goes wrong, except for the fact that maybe he was kind of arrogant when he first got his dreams, but he remained faithful. When Potiphar wanted to seduce him, he remained faithful, and it got thrown him into prison. So he went from being a slave to being a prisoner And throughout all of it, God protected him and honored him. And Joseph was an interpreter of dreams, and Joseph was brought before Pharaoh and correctly interpreted Pharaoh's dreams. And because of that, rescued Egypt from 7 years of famine. And because of Joseph's wisdom, Pharaoh made Joseph second in command of Egypt. Egypt, yes. And when famine hit Canaan, the 11 brothers, 10 of the brothers came down to Joseph in Egypt and said, they didn't know who he was at first, and they came and paid homage to him as a ruler and said, please help us. And it broke Joseph's heart, and he forgave his brothers who had sold him into slavery. And he invited the family from Canaan to come down to Egypt. And the story of Genesis closes with this little band of Joseph's family living in the fertile ground of Goshen in Egypt. Yes. Fade to black. Now we're going to learn the story of Exodus. I'm going to tell you the whole story first, because I will run out of time. Okay, so here's the whole story. It begins like this. Put your pencils down. You're going to learn the whole story right now. It fades to black in Joseph, from Joseph, right? So the first thing we do is we say 400 years. Say that. 400 years slavery. They were enslaved for how many years? 400 years slavery. And then God raises up this man named Moses. And if you've seen the movies, you know that at the end towards the middle of the story, Moses has this big staff, right? And he's the guy that parted the Red Sea. And so he takes his staff and he raises it up in front of the Red Sea and all that. So when we say Moses, we do this. Moses. Say that like it's powerful. Ready? Moses. God raises up Moses, and Moses was saved from being thrown into the Nile River. He was raised in the palace of Pharaoh, and then he committed murder. He found out that he was Hebrew, and he murdered one of the slave traders, and he ran away for 40 years into the desert of, the desert of Midian over here. And then Moses encounters God in a burning bush, and God says, Moses, go back to Egypt and talk to Pharaoh, and say to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's the king of Egypt, say to Pharaoh, let my people go. Say that. Let my people go. And Pharaoh said, no. And then we have the famous stories of the 10 plagues. So God, it's like this big showdown of the gods, right? So for 400 years, the only gods that the people of Israel knew were the gods of Egypt, Ra and Isis and Osiris and Set and all of those gods. So there are 10 plagues that come onto the land of Egypt, the Nile turning to blood, and the gnats and the pestilence on the livestock, and all of these 10 plagues. So what we want to do is we want to say 10 plagues, like these terrible things happening to our bodies, right? So let's say it so far. So we've got 400 years slavery. Moses, let my people go. No. 10 plagues. Now the 10th plague was the terrible one. Moses said to Pharaoh, all of these 9 plagues have come and you haven't let my people go. The last plague is that on this night the angel of death is going to come through the land, and the firstborn child of every house will die. But if you take a lamb into your home, and then on that night, if you take the blood of that lamb and put the blood of that lamb on the doorposts, on the top and on the sides, when the angel of death comes and sees the blood on your household, it will pass over your house and spare the child. Anyone who wants to do this can do this. That is where the story of Passover comes from. Well, that event happened The angel of death came, and Pharaoh's son died. And Pharaoh was distraught, and he said, "Go, just go." And so they came out of Egypt, to this body of water right here called the Red Sea. And here comes Moses. Now, here's a moment where I have to stop, because here's a life lesson for me and for you. At this point, God started leading the people with a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. If you were leading people out of Egypt and you were going to this promised land called Canaan, the most logical way to go would be to go left and take the northern route and walk on land right over Sandy into the promised land. It would take like less than 2 weeks to walk with all those people. Makes sense. But when God led the people out of slavery, the pillar of cloud went right and went toward the wilderness and toward the Red Sea. So suddenly Moses and the people are backed against the Red Sea, and Pharaoh changes his mind. And the greatest army of the greatest empire in the world in that day is now coming down on these newly freed slaves, and Moses is like, "What are we going to do?" And God says, "Raise your staff over the water, Moses," and the Red Sea parts. And the people walk through on dry ground, and then when they turn around, when the armies of Egypt came through the Red Sea, the horse and chariot are drowned in the sea. You see what happened? Whenever God leads us, God always takes us to the impossible and asks us to follow. Because the great empire doesn't destroy the other empires. The great empire trusts and follows into the impossible and lets God do the work. So this ragtag bunch of slaves destroys the greatest army without lifting a single finger. That's how God works with the great nation, right? But I have discovered in my life, and maybe in yours as well, that when you're following the cloud always goes in the way you would never imagine. I'll tell you right now, 20 years ago when I was teaching this class at the big mega church in Las Vegas, thinking I was all cool and all that, the last thing I thought I'd ever be is a Lutheran pastor. But when I first truly encountered this story, I realized that we, as followers of Christ, are called to follow the cloud. And that's hard to do, because the cloud always leads us into the wilderness. So the cloud led them down, then defeated Egypt. They're free at last, right? They're freed from slavery. And then instead of taking them to the promised land, he takes them to Mount Sinai. You have to do that with me now. Mount Sinai. And on the top of Mount Sinai, God gives two things to the people through Moses. He gives them the law, say that with me, the law and the tabernacle. The tabernacle was a little tent in which the people could meet, where the priest could meet the presence of God. We'll talk about that if we have time. So the tabernacle is the place where the presence of God came among the people and camped with them. God dwelt, remember this for later, God tented literally in a tent among them and dwelt with them, right? In a tent. So, the promise that God made to Abraham to be a great nation, now there's lots of people, so you have a lot of people to be a nation. They've defeated the Egyptians, and now what they have is a law which frames the promise, gives them structure to be a society, and now it's time to enter into the promise. So in the book of Numbers, by the way, that's the whole story of Exodus. So let's say the story of Exodus before we go into Numbers. You'll write all this down later. 400 years slavery, Moses, let my people go. No. 10 plagues, Passover, Red Sea, Mount Sinai, law. Oh yeah, sorry, Mount Sinai, law, Tabernacle. Okay, the book of Numbers. We're going to go really fast. They come up, and Moses sends a representative from each of the 12 tribes of Israel into Canaan. And they go into Canaan, into this area called Philistia, and they say, whew, these people are big. There are giants there. It's a really great country. There's lots of milk and honey, right? But there are big dudes in Philistia. So there's 12 spies. 10 say no. 2 say go. Do you hear what I'm saying? 12 spies go in. So we say 12 spies. 10 say no. 2 say go. So in other words, 10 of the 12 spies do not believe that God, who has just defeated the Egyptian army, can take care of the Philistines as well. And they say, no, we can't do it. And only 2 of those spies, named Joshua and Caleb, believed that God could do. So what does God say? Like any good football coach, when a football team gets out of order, what does the coach say? Take a lap. I have run many laps around goalposts as I was growing up, right? Taking a lap because I was being disciplined lovingly by my coach. 40 years. So there is a 40-year lap. The people wandered in the wilderness throughout the book of Numbers until that unbelieving generation died off. And 4 things happened. So we say, so the book of Numbers, 40 years, grumbling, but they were in the wilderness, so they couldn't eat. So God had to provide them food. So he provided them food in 2 ways. The first kind of food was this bread that would appear on the ground each day. And the Hebrew name was manna. Do you know what manna means? What is it? So when you say manna, you have to go, manna? Like that. Do that with me. Manna? And then to provide protein, he provided bird meat in the form of a quail. Right? So the book of Numbers goes like this. 12 spies, 10 say no, 2 say go, take a lap, 40 years, grumbling, manna, quail. And then, after that generation died off, we come into the story of Deuteronomy. Now, the word Deuteronomy means the second giving of the law. So the first giving of the law was at Mount Sinai, law, right? And so the second giving of the law, Moses is an old man now. He's 120 years old, and he's on this side of the Jordan River. Very good. And God tells Moses, you're not going to get to go into the promised land, but Joshua will lead them. So turn around and give the people the law for the second time. The next generation gets the law. And so Moses does something, and we're going to end with this. Imagine that I'm Moses, and you are the people of Israel. Moses takes the people, and he puts one side of them on a hill on this side, and the other side he puts on a hill on this side. And he says, today I set before you life and death. Stand up with me. And this is literally what he did. He got them on these 2 hills, and he said, this side I want you to cry out life. So shout life. This is like the Taste Great, Less Filling commercials back from the day. Face each other. Shout out life. Life. Now you shout out death. Death. Shout out life. Life. Death. Okay, stop. And Moses said to them, the law that God has given you is life. It sets the path of life. And when you go off the rails, of law, you bring death to yourself. So today I set before you life and death. Choose life. That's how we remember Deuteronomy. Ready? Choose life. Now, while we're standing, we're going to tell the whole story of the law, and then we'll take a break. Here we go. 400 years slavery. Moses. Red Sea, Mount Sinai, law, Tabernacle, 12 spies, 10 say no, 2 say go. Take a lap, 40 years, grumbling, manna? Well, choose life. Very good. Have a seat. You want to see how you did? You did good. You could have filled that out yourself.